Hi everyone. So this is going to be our first lectures on the two major motor control theories. And so within this lecture, we're going to be looking at motor program based theories. So there are kind of a few theories that build on each other that we'll go through here. But the general idea is that our major movements that we would um, do anywhere within life. So things like complex sports skills down to things simple as reaching and grabbing something off a countertop. We'd say all those movements are controlled by motor programs. If we think about an analogy of what a motor program is, basically we're looking at running kind of lines of computer code. So if we look at the graphics I have on here, it's imagining writing code to create a certain type of movement. So I'd have a motor program to reach out and pick up a coffee cup, for example. So before we get into motor program theory and specifics, we're going to talk about more generally what motor control is. So what we're trying to do with motor control is we're trying to explain how voluntary human movement happens. So any types of movements involving any of our limbs, all the skeletal muscles, all those movements are similar in the fact that they need to originate from somewhere from the central nervous system. And so what we're looking at is these two major theories. The reason I have these graphics up here is about 2 decades ago, in the 1990s, there were very heated debates over which of these ones were correct. So motor program-based theory looks at some very different ideas very differently from dynamic systems theory. And so there were a lot of heated debates over people thinking they're right, people thinking the other one was wrong. If we step back from that and really kind of look at and dig into each theory, they both explain several things about human movement. Neither one is 100% right. There are some things that motor program based theory explains that dynamic systems theory can't explain, and vice versa. And so, reality, if we can get over the scientists with egos trying to prove the other people wrong, we'd recognize that both of these contribute a lot of knowledge to our understanding of human movement. Okay, so motor control can be something that we look at on a very small scale level or something on a very large scale level. So if we think about a small scale level, if we look at how do we innervate one particular motor unit within a skeletal muscle, we have some basic understanding of that process. We're going to look at more of a macro level in understanding when I have a more complex movement, how does that get organized? So a big component of understanding complex movements and how we control those movements is trying to understand how we control body coordination. So, coordination is patterning of head, body, and limb movements relative to the patterning of environmental objects and events. So basically, I need to coordinate with the things that are around me. So if I'm going to sit down in a chair, I need to make sure I'm organizing myself to in a way that I'm going to end up in that chair and not on the floor. If I'm looking at catching a football, I need to coordinate my body parts to be in conjunction with where that football is going to travel. And I need to have the timing correct that my hands get out to the right place at the right time when the ball gets there. So the two components we look at with coordination are relationships between the body parts. So if we think about when I'm running or when I'm cycling, one leg is typically moving opposite of the other leg. So when one leg's in running, when one leg is in hip flexion, the other leg is in hip extension, and vice versa. Um, we look at how are the body parts interacting with each other. That's an important part of coordination. And also then how I'm coordinating with the environment. So if I'm coming back to the idea of trying to catch a football, I need to be able to get my hands to coordinate together so they're coming together to the right point to be able to catch the ball. But then I also need to coordinate the relationship between those things and where the ball is traveling to. So if we think about the complexity of the motor system, the number of motor units that are involved in performing even the simplest tasks, this becomes a very complex problem. And so we could spend an entire semester in a graduate level course trying to really dissect motor control and still not get very far. We're going to just scratch the surface in this class, trying to understand what are some major theories of how this happens without getting too deep into the mechanisms behind those theories. Okay, so when we're looking at coordinating these complex movements, a major problem we run into, as I've kind of alluded to already, is the degrees of freedom problem. So the question, I'll just pose it and read it here. How does the nervous system control the many muscles and joints involved in producing a complex movement pattern? So if I think about something as simple as grabbing a coffee cup, I'm using just one limb, but I'm coordinating usually four fingers and a thumb. I'm moving at the shoulder, at the elbow, at the wrist, and then of all the joints in the fingers. And so there are several muscles involved. Within each one of those muscles, there are several motor units that are involved. And I need to figure out how do I decide which things to turn on and which things to turn off. So if we look at just the definition of degrees of freedom while we're here, it's number of independent elements or components in the system and the number of ways each component can vary. So I can think about degrees of freedom at a joint level. At the joint level, I think about the shoulder joint. I have several degrees of freedom. I can move in multiple planes. In the elbow joint, I can only move in one plane of movement. So I have far fewer degrees of freedom in how I can move at the elbow. Beyond the joint level, though, at the muscle level, we have a lot of degrees of freedom in which motor units we want to activate. So we're looking at thousands and thousands of motor units being involved in many of our muscle groups. And so we're trying to figure out how do we decide which ones to turn on, which ones to turn off, and even a step above that, just figuring out which muscles do we need to recruit even to be able to do this task. So controlling and constraining the motor system to produce a particular movement is very complex. We're going to come back to how can we answer this question for motor program-based theories around the end of the slideshow. So within motor control, regardless of if we're looking at a dynamic systems theory approach or a motor control theory-based approach, we can recognize that there are two systems that control the motor system. We can look at an open loop control system and a closed loop control system. The key difference here is the major difference is the presence of feedback. So if I think about something like walking, if I'm walking from here across campus, I'm repetitively doing the same thing over and over again. And while I'm doing that, I'm using feedback from the environment to alter my walking mechanics. Feedback from the environment could tell me that I need to shift to the right or left to avoid something. It could tell me that I need to stop because there's a light. It could tell me that I need to move faster or slower for some particular reason. Um, Maybe I need to jump over a puddle that's in front of me or something. And so I'm using that feedback to continually modify my movement. So when we look at that closed loop pattern on the bottom of the screen here, I'm starting with a general idea of what I want to do within the movement control center. So coming from central nervous system here, I'm giving instructions to the movement effectors, the muscles essentially that are going to carry out this movement. And then I'm gathering feedback coming back from multiple sensory sources that tell me how I might want to modify that movement. So basically, I have an initial plan, I send instructions out, I start executing that initial plan, but now I can use feedback to continually modify how I'm doing that, and I would send out new instructions. So throughout this process and tasks where we're able to use feedback, this is a very valuable system because we can continually modify the movement that we're creating. An open loop control system is a control system that does not have any feedback available. So in this system, I need to, before I start the movement, I'm going to decide what I'm going to do. I'm going to send my instructions, and then those movement effectors are going to carry out my instructions. So if I'm doing something like throwing a dart, I am going to do a fairly ballistic movement. So I've maybe taken some time to aim. I've decided where I'm going to target. I've sent instructions to effectors. I'm going to throw that dart, and I can gather feedback. I can gather sensory feedback I can watch where the dart went. I can gather kinesthetic feedback from proprioceptors, etc., that tell me what did that movement feel like, but I can't do anything to change it because the dart's already gone. So this would operate under an open loop control system. So in this scenario, what I would have to do basically is I could still use that sensory feedback, but then I need to start over, and I'm going to maybe recode some different movement instructions, and I'm going to try again. So each time I'm throwing a dart, it's going to operate under open loop control system. Something like walking or balancing that I'm more continually doing it, I can make adjustments as I go. So I think I alluded to this fact, but when we're thinking about the movement instructions, what we're going to program, in the open loop control system, I just need to start with the initial movement. I need to plan, this is what I'm going to do. Closed, I'm going to start with something like that, but then I'm going to continually use feedback I'm getting to modify instructions to be able to change the movement. So if we think about some examples of this, most of the examples of skills that would operate under open loop control are going to be things that occur very rapidly or ballistically that don't allow enough time for us to get that feedback back. There may be some exceptions to that, but almost always we're going to see things that are very quick like this. So throwing a pitch in baseball, hitting a serve in tennis. If we looked at something like I already said, throwing a dart, doing a vertical jump. So these are all examples of things that most likely operate under open loop control. Closed loop examples, things that occur over a little bit longer deal of time. If I think about one of those examples I just gave, something like doing a tennis serve, there is some potential in a skill like that I could be using closed loop control for at least part of the movement. If I think about I'm going into my serve, I'm monitoring my opponent. There's maybe the potential that I could make a slight change to the trajectory of my serve during that motion, but we'd recognize a lot of times if we're trying to do that, it's not going to work out very well because we probably don't really have the time to adequately adjust our movement plans. And we might end up somewhere between the initial plan and the desired plan and end up with a poor performance. So coming back to the motor program concept, so motor program is basically a memory-based construct that is the game plan of how we're going to control a movement. So how we would control a coordinated movement. So if I think about this, basically I'm pulling some instructions off the shelf in my memory, and I'm going to put those into action, sending it out to some effectors. So if I need the motor program-based theories typically argue that pretty much every movement that we would do requires a motor program. So original motor program theory, one of the weaknesses is if I think about all the programs I need to have, it kind of becomes infinite. So I need a motor program for walking. So I'm walking down the sidewalk, I need a motor program for that. But then if I'm walking on ice, I don't know that I can still really use that same motor program because I need to walk quite a bit differently on ice. Same thing if I'm walking on really rough terrain, I need to probably run a different motor program there. So here we have one skill, and we've already developed at least 3 separate motor programs that we would need. Same thing if I'm looking at, I need a motor program to be able to open a can. So I've got my can opener, I got a program, I'm going to draw from memory and figure out how I'm going to open this can. But then if I have this other type of can opener, maybe I need a different motor program. And if I'm going to open this type of a can, I need, again, a totally different motor program. So what we look at with something like this is we would recognize that there's probably no way we can really have a motor program for everything. It really would just overwhelm us, and it just isn't possible. And so one of the major flaws or issues with original motor program theory is that the issue of storage. So there's probably not any possible way that we can account for every single skill that we might need to do and have a separate motor program for each of those skills. A second issue or flaw that we recognize with motor program-based theory is the issue of novelty. So we said we're drawing these motor programs from memory, but if we think about it, we're going to do motor skills that we've never done before. And so if I've never done something before, there shouldn't be a motor program in my memory for that. And so in that scenario, the issue is novelty. So when I do something novel, what happens? Do I just say, okay, I've never done this before, but I want to skateboard now? And then when I go to do that, something like this happens. I just get the blue screen of death in my mind. That's not what happens. And so, again, the issue we have here is apparently I doubled up that slide somehow. The issue we have though is we can't possibly have a motor program for everything, especially things we haven't done before. So these are some key weaknesses of motor program theory. There have been some theories since that have built on those to address some of the issues. We'll talk about those coming up here. Okay, so to address the issue of storage, we considered the concept of instead of having a motor program for everything, maybe we have generalized motor programs that control a class of actions or a number of related things, as opposed to having a completely separate program for every single thing we would do. So when we think about a class of actions, this is a set of different actions that have a common set of features. So if I think about sport of golfing, probably with the exception of putting here, if I'm considering anything from my driver all the way down to my chipper, I'm going to operate a very similar motion here. And I could say for all those, that class of actions of different types of golf swings, so using different clubs, I could say I can probably operate all those under the same generalized motor program. So generalized motor programs have certain invariant features, things that do not change at all. If you're operating that generalized motor program, these things are all going to be the same. And then there are also parameters, which are things that can be varied from one performance to another. So things are going to be slightly different. So if I think about the golf swing example I just gave, any golf swing I use for anything from my wedge or my 9-iron all the way up to my driver, there are certain things that are going to be the same that kind of give the signature of that generalized motor program. And then there are things that I'm going to scale or change based on which club I'm using. They're going to be slightly different. Those are the parameters. So to give some examples of invariant features, remember we're building from theory here, and so to find examples, we basically had to look at behavior and try to find things that were consistent across related actions. Two things that stand out in invariant features are relative time and the order of the sequence of components. So relative time is essentially rhythm. So if I think about playing the same song really slow or playing it much faster. So if I have some type of program where I can speed up or slow down music, it's always going to have the same rhythm, or it's going to have the same proportion of the amount of time spent on each note. The overall time can vary, but we're going to continue to have the same rhythm. Motor skills operating under the same generalized motor program are going to have consistent rhythm or consistent relative timing patterns. So that's one key feature that we can analyze to try to determine, are these two skills operating under the same generalized motor program. The second thing we'd look at then, the order of the sequence of components. This one is fairly logical. If I think about walking, when I'm walking, I'm typically always, not typically always, I'm always going to have a heel strike before I have a toe off. So if I think about different phases of gait, our gait cycle starts with the heel striking the ground, and we kind of round up under our toes, and then the toes lifted off the ground. I can never have a scenario where the toe is lifted first and then the heel strikes. That would not be the same generalized motor program. So the order or sequence that things happen in would always be the same. So a couple examples that we can look at here. This is an illustration that is for a hypothetical task. So this is not any particular task. What we're showing here, though, is the overall time is different on all three of these examples. So this one takes 10 seconds, this one takes 5 seconds, this one takes 15 seconds, but the proportion of the different phases is always the same. So we have 30%, 20%, 40%, 10% on all of these. So if I thought about this in terms of music, I would say this first note would take up 30% of the time, this note would take 20% of the time, 40 and 10. If I thought about this in terms of perhaps walking, if we were able to isolate and say there are 4 different stages in walking, I could say if I'm walking at normal speed, faster speed, or slower speed, the proportion of those phases should always remain the same. Okay, so beyond the invariant features then is the concept of parameters. And the two parameters that we can identify are overall duration and the muscles that are used. So overall duration, remember parameters are things that are changing, adapting based on flexibility of different skills operating under the same generalized motor program. So overall duration changes. So if I go back to that same last slide, we see the overall duration here is 10 seconds, 5 seconds, 15 seconds. So those are parameters that have been scaled to meet the goal of each of these tasks. Remember, again, these are hypothetical tasks, but we're scaling the parameter of overall duration to meet the needs of what we're looking for. Another example we could look at with trying to understand this is thinking about, in my sport of track and field, a lot of times in the throwing events, we use different weighted implements for training. So in the shot put, for example, men compete with a 16-pound shot put. Those men that are going to train with anywhere from an 11-pound shot put up to about a 22-pound shot put. And so with each of those different weights, the overall duration of the throw is going to be longer on a 22-pound shot put, shorter on an 11-pound shot put because it's lighter, but the rhythm or the relative timing of those throws will always stay the same. Okay, so overall duration we know can change based on the needs of the task, and muscles used can change. So if we think about an easy example of this, if I imagine myself going bowling, if we're going to the bowling alley, I can use a generalized motor program to throw a bowling ball right-handed. I should be able to use the same generalized motor program to throw a bowling ball left-handed. So we would have the rhythm of my approach in throwing the bowling ball would be the same, but I'm selecting a right hand or a left hand to do it. Okay, so building a little bit on the concept of a generalized motor program, this fits into Dick Schmidt's schema theory. So Dick Schmidt is one of the biggest names in motor control and learning, passed away fairly recently, but he's written several textbooks and seen as one of the pioneers in this field. So schema theory was his adaptation of motor program theory to account for some of the weaknesses that we saw with that we identified the storage novelty with schema theory before, or sorry, with motor program based theory before. So to understand schema theory, first we have to understand what is a schema. And so a schema, if we look in general psychology, is a rule or a set of rules that provide the basis for a decision. So if I go back and look at these four pictures again, I can look at this and say that's definitely a dog. I can look at that and say that's a dog. Those are dogs too. This is a dog too. These dogs all look very different, but there are certain schemas in place that tell us that that is a dog. Most of these are occurring at a fairly subconscious level. I'm just looking at these and saying, yeah, that looks like a dog. But there are certain schemas there that tell us that this is a dog. So if we apply that to the concept of human movement, so understanding how someone creates a movement like throwing a punch in boxing, for example. That movement is going to be created by first having a generalized motor program, and then second, having motor response schema that modify that generalized motor program to fit the scenario. So what we look at here is we've selected our generalized motor program. I have a generalized motor program, for example, for let's say throwing a jab, if we're sticking on the boxing example. And so I've got that generalized motor program, and now I need to modify that slightly to make it fit, I need to provide rules of how I'm going to do that to make it fit this skill in this situation. So depending on the height of the person I'm trying to punch in this boxing match, I'm going to set a schema to modify the generalized motor program based on that. Depending on maybe the location of where other people are, or not other people, but my opponent, how close he is to me, based on what I think he might counter with. Again, I'm going to select and modify the generalized motor program to be able to make it fit. So essentially here, we're coming back to this concept of parameters that we just talked about, and we're creating rules about the movement to be able to do that. So an important thing to recognize here is we would think about all this happening in the central executive center of the brain, and we'd look at that all being programmed in. So coming back to the idea of where does this come from, I have a generalized motor program that would be stored in memory, and I'm going to take certain motor response schemas to be able to modify that and make it fit this movement. So this definitely addresses the issue of storage. It does so in a way that instead of having several several motor programs for various types of walking, now I have one generalized motor program for walking that I can modify with different motor response schemas. It also, to some extent, addresses the idea of novelty, because if I've never if I've never done a certain type of a kick before, if I'm looking at some type of a kicking motion in any of the martial arts, if I've never done this type of kick before, I don't have a motor program to draw from, but maybe I've done something else that's similar enough that I can draw that generalized motor program, modify it, and maybe it doesn't work very well at first, but maybe I'm eventually able to modify and create a new generalized motor program based on my prior experience, but now fitting more of the needs of this. So it somewhat addresses the concept of novelty, but it doesn't do a great job of doing that. So we recognize that still as a weakness of this theory that dynamical systems theory actually does a lot better job of addressing. Okay, so coming back to the degrees of freedom problem, I said early on in the slides, we'll come back and talk about how this works here. So remember, the degrees of freedom problem is trying to address the question of how do we constrain the motor system enough that we're able to produce the exact movement that we're looking to produce. And so looking at how do we solve the degrees of freedom problem from schema theory, basically we're looking at we're basically saying that we're solving that problem by first drawing the correct generalized motor program that knows which effectors to turn on, which effectors to turn off, and then modifying that to fit our specific needs within this environment. So the main concept is that the central executive is in charge, and we have these motor programs that are sitting on our shelf in memory that we can pull off that are going to, if we think about an example similar to a computer, Anytime you open a program on your computer, you push one button and thousands of lines of code are going to run and operate. We can imagine a generalized motor program running in the same way, where I'm going to select, say, I want to walk over there, and suddenly we are now activating several motor units in different muscles. We're sending inhibitory signals to other muscles that we need to turn off to be successful here. And there's a lot going on that to control that, but we're saying we're basically doing that by sending the right motor program that knows what to turn on and what to turn off in a real basic terms. So when we look at motive control under schema theories, remember we talked about the closed loop system and the open loop system. With schema theory, we're saying that we are starting our movement from a motor program, and so that would suggest we have these initial plans that are coming from the generalized motor program that we're going to operate and send out there. So any movement that we execute would basically start with open loop control. And then if there's time available, if we're doing a type of skill that is not so quick that there's not time for feedback to get back, we can shift from open loop control to modifying, basically adding different schemas to that generalized motor program through the feedback that we receive. So we'd start with an open loop control, we send out our initial instructions, but then if feedback becomes available, that's additional information that helps us to modify schemas to adapt the movement to meet our specific needs at this time. Okay, a couple examples then of evidence of schema theory. So we talked about the invariant features of a generalized motor program, and we said relative timing is one of those invariant features. So if we looked at walking and running, basically what we'd want to know is this tells us is the relative timing between walking and running the same or different. So what this graph is showing us is there's a separate line here that represents 4 different phases of walking and 4 different phases of running. So E1, E2, and E3 are all 3 extension phases, and F is the flexion phase of walking. Same thing over here with running. We have 4 points on each of these sides because they had people move at 4 different speeds. So walking at 3, 4, 5, and 6 miles per hour, running at 8, 9, 10, and 12 miles per hour. And so what we can see across all these 4 different walking conditions, so within the walking conditions, I changed my absolute time because we adjusted the speed. We see relatively stable patterns where E3 is going to account for about 50% of our step cycle. E1 is looking at about 25 to 30%. E2 is down here around probably 12 to 14, 12 to 16%. And then the F phase, the flexion phase, accounts for right around 10%. So it's a very stable pattern. Same thing with running. It's not quite as clear here, but especially if we look at the higher speeds, we see a very stable pattern of what percentage of the step cycle each phase accounts for. So we'd say within these 4 walking conditions, same generalized program. Within these 4 running conditions, probably same generalized motor program because we see a pretty stable pattern. Now, if we go across those, though, and compare the walking conditions to the running conditions, the percents here are very different from the percents here. And so that would suggest that walking and running are operating under different generalized motor programs because the invariant feature of relative time is not stable across those conditions. This is just looking at it in a slightly different way, probably a lot easier to understand. Here on the walking side, if we average all the speeds together, we can see that E3 counts for about half, and then we have the breakdown there. And we can see very clearly that, again, this is a much different pattern from the relative timing pattern over here. So by seeing that these patterns differ pretty substantially, again, that just tells us that these really are not operating under the same generalized motor program. Okay, so summarizing, coming back to the whole here, if we're looking at controlling any type of human movement, something as simple as picking up a finger and putting it back down, or as complex as running down a runway and jumping over a 20-foot bar while we're pole vaulting. Whether it's simple or complex, we understand that the process behind those movements is always incredibly complex, where we're trying to activate certain things and deactivate certain things, and activate those things in coordinated pattern that we have a smooth, fluent movement. So, and looking at how we do that from the motor program-based theory perspective, schema theory would suggest that we take a generalized motor program from memory stores. We create particular schemas that are going to fit the scenario in front of us, and that leads to the movement that emerges. Um, Dynamic systems theory, when we look at that in the next lecture, we'll see a very different example or a very different take on how that happens. We address the weaknesses here of this approach are the concepts of storage and novelty. So generalized motor programs as opposed to motor programs for everything somewhat address these, especially on the storage side, but we're still recognizing we need a lot of generalized motor programs in memory, and we still recognize that there are things that we have never done that we're going to be put into scenarios to do, and sometimes we can end up being very successful at those right away, having never done them before. So that suggests something about that movement can't be controlled from a generalized motor program because we probably don't have one to control it. All right, that's it for this one, and we'll pick up on the next slide with our next slideshow with dynamic systems.